It is my honor to introduce Dr. Cumings. Bruce Cumings is an American historian of East Asia, professor, lecturer, and author. He's the former chair of the history department at the University of Chicago. He specializes in modern Korean history and contemporary international relations. In May 2007, Dr. Cumings was the first recipient of the Dejung Academic Award for Outstanding Achievements in Scholarly Contributions to Democracy, Human Rights, and Peace granted by South Korea. The award is named in honor of 2000 Nobel Peace Prize winner and former President of South Korea, Kim Dejung. So without further ado, let's hear from Dr. Cumings.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and I'd particularly like to thank Elizabeth Cho for introducing me and also for arranging my visit from Chicago to Washington. I want to talk today about basically two fundamental facts of the Korean War. One is that it is the original American forever war. It really started before June 25th, 1950, and it hasn't ever ended. In Robert De Niro's film called A Bronx Tale, maybe the most riveting scene in the movie is when a motorcycle gang enters a bar run by the mafia and begins to get rowdy. The neighborhood mafia boss admonishes them, asks them to be quiet, otherwise they have to leave. They promise to be gentlemen, and he allows them to stay in the bar. Then they start spraying beer all over the bar, and the mafia boss goes to the door and locks it and says, "Now yous can't leave." And immediately the motorcycle gang people realize they made a terrible mistake. In effect, this is a metaphor also for American involvement in Korea. Korea is the best example in the modern world. Koreans understand that Americans first came to Korea in force in September 1945, not June 1950. But most Americans have no understanding that the U.S. set up a military government for 3 years that deeply shaped post-war Korean history. 25,000 soldiers landed in September 1945, shortly after Dean Rusk drew a line on the Korean peninsula that no one had ever noticed before, except for geographers, I guess, at 38 degrees north latitude. Today, 28,000 American troops remain, and the war has never ended. When you look at the formerly secret documentation behind the dispatch of American troops to Korea originally in 1945, it was to head off guerrillas from Manchuria who might take over the peninsula, presumably with the help of the Soviets. Today, American and South Korean troops hold off Kim Il-sung's grandson, Kim Jong-un. So we went in there to try and contain or overthrow Kim's regime, and here we are so many decades later dealing with his grandson, only now the grandson has a full panoply of nuclear weapons. The title of this paper is No Exit, which might be the best epitaph for Korea, called the Forgotten War in the U.S. Last June, we had the 70th anniversary of the conventional start of this war. Next month, we mark the armistice. And in August will come the 111th anniversary of Japan's colonization of Korea. These events are inextricably related. The Kim regime traces its legitimacy back to guerrilla struggles that began when Japan established its third major colony in 1932, the puppet state of Manchukuo. Surviving guerrillas and their offspring formed the core leadership of North Korea in 1948 and became the elite of that country ever since. Meanwhile, 80,000 U.S. troops in Japan and Korea stand in for the strong Japanese military that existed before 1945. So even today, we don't know what an independent Japan would truly look like. North Korea inhabits its own time machine, beating against a strong tide they call American imperialism. Its generals prepare not just to fight the last war, but structure their entire society as a fighting machine, determined sooner or later to win a victory that was palpable for a moment in 1950, but has exceeded their grasp ever since. The result is a garrison state meaning a nation where the military is the dominant force. The military has always been the dominant force in North Korea, more so than the Korean Workers' Party. It's maybe the most amazing garrison state the world has ever seen. If we could know everything there is to know about North Korea, you would find 15,000 underground facilities of a national security nature, almost all of the military underground, caves, tunnels, everywhere. It's a very formidable regime in the sense that it can muster a very strong defense, even if it can't really have an offense that would defeat anybody in its neighborhood. It's just astonishing that North Korea has the fourth largest army in the world. The U.S. has the third largest at 1.4 million, North Korea 1.3 million, but of course there are 330 million Americans and 25 or 26 million North Koreans. So every adult North Korean has military experience, spent a long time in the military, 10 years for men, a lesser number of years for women. American diplomacy has its own recalcitrant timelessness, its own default positions that last for decades and get nowhere. We really have to punish those nasty, incorrigible North Koreans for seizing the Pueblo spy ship in 1968, trimming a poplar tree in the DMZ in 1976, blowing up the South Korean cabinet in 1983 in Rangoon, dumping 8,000 plutonium rods out of their reactor in 1994, launching their first intercontinental ballistic missile in 1998, another one in 2006 on the American Independence Day, July 4th, a first atomic bomb in 2006, and a second one in 2009 on the American Memorial Day. And finally, the Trump administration came very close to giving Pyongyang a so-called bloody nose, a preemptive bloody nose in December 2018. I don't know if you remember that, but Victor Cha, who is known to a number of us here, professor at Georgetown, was being considered for the ambassadorship, American ambassadorship to South Korea, and he participated in these meetings about giving North Korea a bloody nose, and to his credit, walked out, gave up whatever ambassadorship he might have had, and said that they don't know what they're doing because North Korea will respond to that so-called bloody nose. Around that time, there was discussion in the press of the U.S. moving all Americans out of South Korea before giving North Korea a bloody nose. 200,000 is the figure that was in the press. I didn't know there were that many Americans here in Korea. But the North Korean ambassador to the UN just said to one of our diplomats, if you do that, if you move those Americans out of South Korea, we'll know it means war. So that's how close we came once again to a devastating war, probably a war that would escalate to nuclear weapons. It's one of the most irrational situations one can imagine, where we, as Americans, as the government and government policy, have allowed North Korea to morph from a country that was a minor threat in the 1950s to one that is now one of a handful of nuclear weapon states, without ever exercising the diplomacy that might bring an end to the Korean War. And if, I wanted to add, you know, with the literature that you have for this meeting on ending the Korean War, that if the Korean War is ended, then it would follow logically that the U.S. would normalize relations with North Korea and exchange embassies, which is something I have been advocating for a very long time. You know, diplomacy arose in world history not so that friends could deal with each other diplomatically, but so enemies could talk and deal with each other. That's what diplomacy really means, and yet we have, the U.S. as a matter of policy has refused, with a couple of exceptions, diplomacy with North Korea. Another default principle in Washington, and this is in some ways the most serious mistake that the U.S. makes about North Korea, is that North Korea stands for nothing, has no support from its people, is a terrible dictatorship, and that's the only reason it's still in power, but it will soon collapse. Since the Berlin Wall fell, a bipartisan consensus has adhered to the axiom that North Korea will soon explode or implode. More than 3 decades of wishful thinking without really thinking about what would happen if North Korea were to collapse. I don't want to toot my own horn, it's obnoxious, but the fact is I've argued since 1989 that North Korea was not going to collapse. And what was the principle or logic of that argument? There are a handful of states in the world that are opponents of American imperialism. And that's in many ways, the leitmotif of their existence. North Korea, Iran, Cuba, China, and Vietnam. North Korea, China, and Vietnam, and Cuba, communist countries that did not collapse after the Berlin Wall fell. Iran is a somewhat different case. It is the most anti-American state on the face of the earth. A recent study by a couple of political scientists basically backed up what I'm arguing here and what I've always thought, which is that North Korea is fundamentally an anti-imperialist state. That was written into its constitution in 1948 when the imperialism they were worried about was Japan's. And then during and after the Korean War, it became the U.S. You may not like that. You may wish they would do something else. But it explains why they don't give up and yell uncle and say, okay, you win. Most American officials dealing with North Korea don't accept what I just said. They don't even recognize it. They see North Korea primarily through a lens of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, rather than seeing that North Korea is of itself a particular kind of anti-American state, and that helps explain its longevity. It's lasted a lot longer than the Soviet Union. I mean, think of that. I was in Washington for a meeting at the State Department, an open meeting where they invite scholars, about 10 years ago. And I sat there while I heard, A, North Korea was going to collapse, and B, when it does collapse, the Marines have to go in to get loose nukes. They've got to corral the nuclear weapons sort of loose in North Korea so that the Chinese don't get them, or somebody, maybe we could cooperate with the Chinese to get them. This is the level of absurdity that exists for Washington's policy. And that was under just Bush and Obama, not just Bush. Can you imagine Marines in Okinawa taking off for North Korea, and they somehow land, and they're running around in a country that's 85% mountainous with 15,000 underground facilities, and they're looking for nuclear weapons? I mean, it's like a Bugs Bunny cartoon rather than something serious, and yet I've heard this time and time again, and it again expresses the utter lack of appreciation of what kind of a country you're dealing with in North Korea. An army of 1.3 million people, and they're going to disappear so that Marines can find nuclear weapons? But ultimately, this kind of absurdity is what we've gotten ourselves into by abjuring diplomacy and focusing only on one thing about North Korea, its nuclear weapons. I'm going to skip a little bit here so that I can move forward quickly. I wanted to talk, and I write in this paper, about the armistice, a little bit about how it came about and why it needs to be got rid of in favor of a peace agreement. You all know that this is a ceasefire. It's an agreement not to fight, not a peace treaty. In 1953, when the armistice was finally signed on July 27th, the Eisenhower administration claimed that North Korea and China signed the armistice because of nuclear threats, threats to use nuclear weapons against them. Eisenhower and his Secretary of State Dulles said this many times, and I think they actually believed it. I don't believe it because secret documents don't demonstrate that threats to use nuclear weapons brought the armistice about. It was primarily Stalin's death and the terrible war that North Korea had been suffering that led the Chinese and North Koreans to sign the armistice. But here we are, you know, in 2021 with North Korea having probably 20 atomic weapons. And we go back to 1953, and the President of the United States is openly threatening to use nuclear weapons against this small country. And then the same administration in 1958 put Honest John missiles, Matador cruise missiles, and then ultimately landmines, all of them nuclear, tactical nuclear weapons in Korea, and they stayed there till 1991. Now, the logic that comes out of that is that the opponent would desperately try to get hold of the one thing that blocks the use of nuclear weapons, and that's your own nuclear weapons. North Korea has just been very rational in that sense. We are the ones who threatened North Korea with nuclear weapons, starting in the Korean War and thereafter. President Obama was particularly bad in this respect, in that he had B-1 and B-2 bombers lifted over the Korean theater with the Pentagon always saying these bombers are nuclear capable. They dropped dummy nuclear weapons on an island in South Korea during the Obama administration. So we're talking about an armistice that was, according to President Eisenhower, forged in the context of nuclear blackmail. In this same period, the government urged the newspapers to feature stories about the first atomic shell shot from a cannon, which exploded on May 26, 1953 in Nevada with 10 kilotons of nuclear force. That nuclear cannon was featured in the New York Times. I don't remember if it was on the front page or later in the paper. The Eisenhower administration also blew off the mightiest atomic blast ever exploded in Nevada in this same period, Some people thought it was a hydrogen bomb. It wasn't. So these tests, which were open to journalists, or at least allowed journalists to be informed about them, were other ways in which the Eisenhower administration claimed to bring this war to a close. So if possessing and using nuclear weapons is a sin, and I think it is, because these are weapons of mass destruction, the U.S. Was the first sinner at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and most people don't understand the American nuclear force posture in Korea, but it's absolutely outrageous that we've been threatening North Korea with nuclear weapons going back to when I was 10 years old. To bring more pressure on North Korea to sign the armistice, the U.S. Air Force hit large dams. Ones built by the Japanese. These are sometimes called irrigation dams. They're not. They're very high Hoover Dam style, if smaller, big dams. And in May 1953, just as rice was planted, these dams were hit, several. The Pujan River Dam was estimated to hold 670 million cubic meters of water. When 59 F-84 Thunderjets breached the high containing wall on May 13th, 1953, the onrushing flood destroyed 6 miles of railway, 5 bridges, 2 miles of highway, 5 square miles of rice paddies, scooped clean 27 miles of river valley, and sent water rushing even into Pyongyang. By the way, I mean, just as a matter of scholarly fact, this was a clear war crime to hit these dams. An American, official American history put it this way. So we killed civilians, friendly civilians, and bombed their homes, fired whole villages with the occupants, women and children, and 10 times as many hidden communist soldiers under showers of napalm, and the pilots came back to their ships stinking of vomit, twisted from their vitals by the shock of what they had to do. Anyway, I'll leave that particular subject, but it's just astonishing the amount of force that the U.S. either deployed in the case of hitting North Korean dams or threatened in the form of nuclear weapons to get this armistice signed. Now, a conference to work out peace arrangements in Korea and Vietnam. The French had lost their war against the Vietnamese at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This conference was scheduled in Geneva, where President Biden just met with Putin in Geneva last week. It was scheduled in 1954, but the Eisenhower administration had no intention of signing a peace treaty with North Korea and China. In 1986, I interviewed U. Alexis Johnson, who was a top deputy to John Foster Dulles, an American negotiator at the Geneva conference. Johnson told me that Geneva, designed to replace the Korean armistice with a durable peace, was to the American delegation merely an empty exercise to be gotten through because they weren't going to sign a peace treaty. And I asked him, how do you prepare for a conference when you have no hope that negotiations are going to change anything? And he said, oh, you make sure you make your speeches, and you also try to make sure Korean Foreign Minister Pyun is well established and knows what he's supposed to do, and you don't let Syngman Rhee sabotage it. Those were his exact words. So the U.S. had no intention whatsoever to end this war when it should have been ended in 1954. If you look at the agreements on Vietnam, they're much more serious. I mean, there were no agreements on Korea, but there were agreements on Vietnam hammered out at Geneva between the U.S., North Vietnamese, Chinese and others. One more minute. Well, Elizabeth said I have one more minute, and guess what? I'm already done. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Cumings. So fast forward, now we have Christine on. She will talk about the current situation, Women Cross DMZ's activity, Korea Peace Now activity on ending the Korean War and entering the era of peace, today's subject.
Echo, give me a thumbs up. Okay. All right, I'm going to share my screen because I have a little. Okay, view screen. So thank you so much for inviting me today on this anniversary of the official start of the Korean War. I'm deeply honored to be speaking alongside Bruce and Hyuk-kyo, two teachers who I've learned so much from over the decades, actually. As you heard, I'm the founder and executive director of Women Cross DMZ, which is an organization of women mobilizing to end the Korean War. In 2015, on the 70th anniversary of Korea's division by Cold War powers, we led 30 women peace activists from 15 countries to cross the DMZ from North Korea to South Korea. With our partners, we held Women's Peace Symposia with over 250 women in both Pyongyang and in Seoul, where we heard from Korean women on the impact of the unresolved war on their lives, and where women from Liberia, Northern Ireland, Colombia, the US, and other countries shared strategies for how women can cross religious, ethnic, and national lines to bring an end to war and conflict in their countries. We then marched with 10,000 Korean women on the wide boulevards of Pyongyang, on the cobblestone streets of Kaesong, and along the barbed wire fence in Paju, calling for an end to the Korean War, with a peace agreement, family reunions, and women's leadership in the peace-building process. Since then, we have continued our long march for a peace agreement to formally end the Korean War. In 2019, we launched a transnational feminist campaign, Korea Peace Now, with the Korean Women's Movement for Peace. We don't see you or your screen. Okay, that's not good. You don't see me or the screen? I need some instruction from the person on the phone. Because if you don't see me or the screen, then you're just hearing me talk. 여보세요.
네, 잘 들립니다.
근데 그 줌 비디오가 안 나온대요. 제가 지금 PowerPoint 쓰는데요. There I am. Okay. Can you see me now? Can you see the screen?
예, 나옵니다.
Okay. So we launched this transnational feminist campaign. We, with 3 other feminist organizations, the Nobel Women's Initiative in Canada, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, based in Geneva, and we've been building a grassroots movement of people power led by women to call for a formal end to the Korean War. For decades, the U.S. and its allies have tried to pressure North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. But pressure, whether in the form of sanctions, isolation, military threats, just hasn't worked. In fact, it's only exacerbated the problem. So, for example, a recent study found that the joint military exercises that the U.S. holds routinely with South Korea doesn't deter North Korea, but instead, quote, incites provocative rhetoric and actions, end quote. Thus, despite being the most sanctioned country in the world, North Korea is estimated to possess up to 60 nuclear weapons. And, you know, as Bruce and Hyuk-kyo talked about, the risk of another devastating war in Korea remains very real. So since the armistice is basically defining the terms of the relationship, you know, we're at a trigger moment to escalate rapidly into a conflict. So from our point of view, from the women's peace movement, we believe that to convince somebody to put down a gun, you first have to convince them that they will not be harmed. And that to do that, we have to address the root cause of the conflict, which is the unresolved status of the Korean War, that will then lead to building trust and create the conditions necessary for denuclearization. So we have come up with a frame that is a peace-first approach, not at the end of a process. So the campaign, Korea Peace Now, recently produced the Path to Peace report, and this is it right here. We would be happy to send you a copy. It's 71 pages, and it's on the principle, peace now, peace first, peace without preconditions or sweeping demands. You want to achieve humanitarian aid, you want to achieve human rights, you want to achieve denuclearization, you need a peace-first approach. And our report explains how a peace agreement can advance actually all those issues, and why it doesn't also necessarily mean the end of the US-ROK alliance. So you can read the entire report on the KoreaPeaceNow.org site, and we also have one-page fact sheets on each of the subtopics. But the report also calls for the inclusion of women's groups and civil society in the peace process, because research shows that when women are involved in peace processes, an agreement is actually likely to be reached and to endure. Between 1991 and 2017, women's groups were involved in 71, oh geez, now my thing is frozen. That's the peace report, found that women's groups were involved in 71% of informal peace processes, and that our participation helped to legitimize the formal peace process among the public. And it's really a fascinating thing to see the data, and then to actually see that we are living data, because that's exactly what we are doing. According to Joe Cirincione, who is a nuclear expert and former president of the Plowshares Fund, he says, through the dedicated effort, effective work of Women Across DMZ, the issue of a peace agreement between North Korea and the United States has moved from the back burner of policy debate to the front of mind. They have convincingly demonstrated that we cannot end North Korea's nuclear program without a comprehensive peace, end quote. So how are we legitimizing the formal peace process among the public? I just want to share a few tactics. Well, one, we've been engaging senior officials. We believe it's important to speak to all sides. During the Trump administration, we engaged Matthew Pottinger from the National Security Council, Stephen Biegun, who became the Deputy Secretary of State. We sent our Path to Peace report to the State Department now under the Biden administration. We organized a letter of 71 prominent Korean Americans urging President Biden to end the Korean War, and we've briefed the Office of Global Women's Issues and also several UN agencies, from the Department of Political and Peace Affairs to UN Women and Arms Control. And we meet, obviously, with the South Korean government at the Blue House, Moon Chung-in, regularly, and also I traveled in December of 2019, before the pandemic, to meet Mr. Oh Ryong-il from the National Peace Committee because of the U.S. travel ban to the DPRK. We work with members of Congress on legislation on the Korean War, on the Korean Peninsula Act, which calls for serious, urgent diplomatic engagement in pursuit of a binding peace agreement constituting a formal end to the Korean War. He also calls for the lifting of the travel ban and for liaison offices between the U.S. and DPRK. So this, I think, which I credit to the organizing by the grassroots, that when we organize and we build power together, that we can begin to shift the conversation. So a key part of creating the political will and space for peace is amplifying, I believe, the voices of the grassroots. And so we have Spock organizing team. Echo is one of the organizers along with Hyun Lee. We have Colleen Moore, who leads our advocacy work in Washington, D.C. And we've now organized chapters in 12 regions across the U.S. We are multi-generational Korean Americans. We're peace activists, veterans, students, housewives, small business owners, academics. We collectively press for an end to the Korean War. We do this through postcards, organizing house meetings, writing letters to the editors, telling their personal stories, and, and then in July, we're doing a virtual advocacy week. We have over 200 people signed up, and if you haven't done so already, we would love for you to join us. Let's get to 300. Wouldn't that be an amazing thing? We amplify our messages through the media. We regularly publish op-eds, speak in public forums like this, on TV, on radio. We seize every opportunity to get our message out there. And as we've shown with our reports, whether the Path to Peace report that we released, or also this one on the gendered and human impact of sanctions on North Korea, we have to educate about the violence imposed by sanctions. And so this was a multidisciplinary report, including humanitarian workers, scholars, legal experts, and we use this opportunity to push back against the UN Security Council and also the US. And it was so effective that I personally got a phone call from Stephen Biegun, who had some harsh words to say to me about the report, but I think that that shows impact. We also bring together women peace builders to discuss our vision for the peace process. In 2018, we brought North and South Korean women together with women from China, Japan, Russia, the US, and Canada for the first ever Northeast Asia Women, Peace, and Security Roundtable. We talked, we laughed, we shared meals, we discussed how we can achieve a more peaceful future with women at the peacemaking table. And in fact, at that meeting, Jackie O'Neill, who has since become the first Women, Peace, and Security Ambassador to Canada, presented several examples of how women's peace groups inserted themselves at the peacemaking table in different conflicts around the world. And I was actually able to give that similar presentation when I went to meet Stephen Biegun at the State Department. And I hope to do the same when we hopefully get a meeting with Wendy Sherman. So lastly, we're redefining what makes us secure. The pandemic has laid bare that all the investments in weapons and preparation for war won't protect us, and what we need is a fundamental reorientation of what makes us secure: food, clean environment, homes, healthcare, jobs. And we recognize that it's critical to end the Korean War, not just because of the threat of nuclear annihilation that would foremost impact the Korean people, but because the status of the unresolved war is violence. Violence against separated families, against innocent Korean civilians living under sanctions, against Korean people living under the national security laws in both Koreas. And this Cold War division has long legs and impacts everyone in the region, from the Okinawan people fighting the occupation of U.S. military bases, the Chamorro indigenous people of Guam, who are targets of North Korea's retaliation against the U.S. first strikes, and so many U.S. military installations are there. And here in Hawaii, where I'm living, where residents truly believed that a North Korean missile was ready to strike, and now 20,000 U.S. Marines will be moving on to Oahu as part of the U.S. pivot to Asia. So I'm going to close by saying, Bruce Cumings, whose work has just, obviously profoundly shaped my thinking, but he writes that the Korean War inaugurated the military-industrial complex, that in 3 years, the U.S. defense spending quadrupled and set forth the U.S. to become the world's police, military police. So ending the longest forever war that the U.S. has against North Korea won't be just symbolic in terms of reversing America's long march towards militarization. It will have tangible effects on people's lives throughout the entire Asia-Pacific region. And I believe peace on the Korean Peninsula will be a game changer and help neutralize the great power competition between the U.S. and China. So I I'm just honored to be with you, and I do believe that we can. And this when we have a critical window with President Moon in office till March, and a liberal president in the White House. But it will take us to put the pressure now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. We'll move on with Hyuk-kyo. So Hyuk-kyo, our next presenter, is president of National Association of Korean Americans based in Fairfax, Virginia, which advocates for a peaceful settlement in the Korean Peninsula, along with civic empowerment for Koreans in the U.S. He's a graduate of Columbia University and has worked as journalist, editor, publisher, and community organizer and activist. Previously, he was the director of DC-based Korea Information and Resources Center and the editor of Korea Report, an English language news magazine on Korean affairs and policy. Hyuk-kyo?
예, 반갑습니다. 특히 평통위원들 너무 다시 만나게 돼서 반갑습니다. 예, 제 발자는 영어로 준비했으니까 영어로 할게요. 예. So thank you to the organizers for sponsoring this timely event. I am particularly honored to speak in the same forum with Professor Bruce Cumings, who has been an inspiration to many Korean scholars and activists in understanding post-World War II Korea. His seminal book, The Origins of Korean War, has shed new light in truly understanding the extent of U.S. involvement/intervention in modern Korean affairs, especially during the crucial time when Korea was divided against its will in 1945. And I brought the book from home. This is the book. This is a book published in 1981 in 2 volumes. This is volume 1, the second one in volume 2. So if you want to understand modern Korea, this is required reading. Many people try to criticize Professor Cumings without reading the book, but I urge you to read the book. And this is the painting by Picasso. It's called Massacre in Korea, and it depicts the massive toll on civilians by the war and the war. So it's a very moving picture in the book. I myself, in my studies, cited the book extensively on my university thesis. So it pains me to hear that the book is baselessly judged as being somehow pro-North by some South Korean circles, just because it challenges the conventional orthodox narrative of the U.S. role in modern Korean history. And unfortunately, this is so even among South Korean journalists who should be diligent in researching primary materials and doing fact-checking. So one of the papers that covered this event said that this book is pro-North because it talks about not invasion from North, but invasion from South, which is groundless. It doesn't say so. It talks about the border clashes and border skirmishes, but it doesn't talk about invasion coming from South. So it just twists, some journalists twist the meaning of it, and then that's the whole book right there. So it's like very unfortunate. And we have some journalists here. So how many reporters are here? Can you show me the hands? How many reporters? So we have few, right? So I hope you can report these issues clearly and without any judgment or opinion. Because sometimes, quotes get misquoted, and the analysis can be misled into different stuff. So and we experience that. So please be diligent in that respect. The book is a result of a meticulous research and keen analysis by Professor Cumings, using a plethora of declassified U.S. government documents. As primary sources, which clearly shows that the U.S. government was unilaterally intent and aggressively acted on gaining a foothold, albeit partially, half of it, on the Korean Peninsula at the end of the World War II for its own geopolitical end, even if that meant that that fateful decision would likely lead to potentially prolonged division and internal turmoil of a liberated country. Let me repeat that, it's very important. The U.S. government was unilaterally intent and aggressively acted on gaining a foothold, more than Soviet Union, albeit partially on the Korean Peninsula at the end of the World War II for its own geopolitical end, to protect Japan and to prevent further communist incursions, whatever. Even if that meant that that fateful decision would likely lead to potentially prolonged division. You cannot have a temporary division. Look at Africa. Look at Middle East. You don't have a temporary division by drawing a line on the sand. It becomes permanent, you know. So, and the internal turmoil of the liberated country. Korea was liberated, jubilant that they would build a new nation. You know, people of all colors and political leanings came together to form a coalition government, but that didn't happen because U.S. proposed this division of Korea, and that led to further divisions internally, you know, and so forth. And how do we commemorate wars generally? We normally do not focus on how they started or who made the first shot. We usually remember them for the conclusion of wars, when peace or armistice replaced fighting wars. For example, for the World War I, we celebrate the Armistice Day, when the fighting ended, on November 11th. We don't talk about the assassination of Ferdinand, Archbishop Ferdinand. We talk about the Armistice Day. For the World War II, we mark the end of the war in the European front on May 8th, and the Pacific front and the overall war on August 15 or September 2nd. But somehow the Korean War is generally remembered on June 25th. It's even called the June 25th War in South Korea, when the North Korean army initiated a major offensive, an invasion southward. And not on July 27, when the Korean War armistice was signed by three parties representing a multitude of nations, and when the fighting actually stopped. After 3 bloody years of escalations that led to horrific casualties and destructions that resulted in more than 3 million dead. What Professor Cumings and others have shown was that the seeds of the Korean War were planted as early as 1945 and subsequently during the crucial period of 1945 to 1948, the crucial nation building, when DPRK and ROK was formed separately, mainly due to the U.S. actions, and even prior to the consolidation of communist power in the North. And it is also simplistic to assess the Korean War solely on the North Korea's invasion, when other key momentous events, such as the U.S. decision to cross the 30th parallel and occupy North Korea, another invasion there, thereby switching from containment to a rollback policy of rolling back the communist country. The cross-border bombing near and into China and the resulting Chinese intervention must be factored in the overall assessment of the Korean War. The Korean War is referred to as a forgotten war in the US, but Koreans cannot forget all the human casualties, wanton destructions, and painful separation of family members, numbering in millions. The younger Korean generations may only read about the war in textbooks and may not care. But we still have Korean War survivors amongst our parents, grandparents, and relatives, and concerned citizens who do care. And please allow me to tell a personal story about separate families. My father-in-law passed away last month. His older brother, who was raised in the South, somehow ended up in North Korea when the Korean War ended. And he wasn't forcefully taken there as a prisoner. After my father-in-law became a U.S. citizen, he was able to travel to North Korea when the travel ban was not in place yet, and was able to reunite with his long-lost brother. His mother was also able to go on the trip and meet her eldest son after more than 3 decades of separation. My wife was able to meet her grown-up cousins for the very first time. And my mother-in-law is also a part of a separated family altogether. She went to the South from the North by herself as a student in 1945 to advance her studies, when the 30th parallel was not yet solidified as a border, but was not able to go back home due to rising political tensions and turmoil, and settled in the South and met my father-in-law and married. During the family trip to North Korea with her husband, she was also able to meet her own separated brother and relatives. So you cannot really imagine the joy and emotions during these reunions. They're real emotions of joy, and but then they had to get separated again, and they couldn't see again because the increasing tension between U.S. and DPRK and the travel ban, so they cannot go back to meet them again. They were the lucky ones, because there are still millions of Koreans who have no clue if other separated family members are living or dead, and many members are now dying due to old age. So addressing the issue of the reunion of separate families quickly, including the lifting of the travel ban to North Korea, is a crucial part of ending the painful legacy of the Korean War. So let's not get fixated on who started the Korean War, as history, in the end, will be remembered on how the war ended, not on how it began. But we still do not have that ending story for the Korean War, as we only have a temporary armistice and not a more permanent peace treaty that would officially end the war. And let us not fool ourselves. A peace treaty in itself, though powerful symbolically, will not guarantee a lasting peace in the Korean Peninsula. We still need a comprehensive multilateral peace settlement and multinational security mechanisms that can ensure stable and lasting peace in the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. For this end, the U.S., perhaps in a spirit of rectifying its original sin of dividing Korea, should proactively and responsibly propel the Korea peace process forward. My sense is that since the U.S. was instrumental in initiating the division of Korea in 1945, perhaps it should be the one that initiates the official end of the Korean War. But we are seeing another impasse in the long, ongoing negotiations for peace settlement in the Korean Peninsula between Washington and Pyongyang. I will not go in depth about what may need to happen to fix that situation, but let me just share one thought, one insight. When Joe Biden was a ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 2004, he hosted a historic and unprecedented three-way forum in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing room that brought together legislators from the U.S. and both North and South Korea together in one room to frankly discuss ways to ensure peace and security in the Korean Peninsula. That event was sponsored by the Korea Society and NACA, which I was part of. We should have more of those kind of happenings, more engagement, more dialogue than confrontation and threats. Likewise, at this time, would it be too much to ask President Biden to make some kind of his own initiative, as he did in 2004, to break this kind of impasse? Nearly 7 decades have passed since the Korean War armistice was signed. The Cold War is over. The U.S. and the People's Republic of China are no longer fighting enemies as they were in the Korean War, though we see new tensions arising. China is South Korea's largest trading partner. The two sides of Korea have affirmed mutual reconciliation and non-aggression several times already. So it is about time to end the ambiguous and fragile chapter of the Korean War armistice and move to a new chapter towards more permanent peace settlement in Korea. The Koreans, more than any people, and rightly so, desperately want genuine and lasting peace in their homeland. This very forum, organized by the DC chapter of Pyeongtaung, the National Unification Advisory Council of the Republic of Korea, is a testament to that fact. As you know, Pyeongtaung was created and nurtured by South Korean dictatorships of the past to legitimize their harsh rule, whose activities were antithetical to peace and unification, to say the least. But now, under democratic governments in South Korea, Pyeongtaung is in the forefront of the movement for peaceful settlement in Korea, along with a diverse array of NGOs and grassroots organizations, both in South Korea and overseas, as in Washington, D.C. It is my sincere hope that eventually we can mark the Korean War not on June 25th or even July 27th, but on the very date that the Korean War Peace Treaty would be finally signed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hyuk-kyo. So we have Professor Taehyun Nam. He drove all the way from Salisbury, Maryland, which is about 3 hours away, and he's sort of our surprise panel, and maybe he can open up the floor for discussion and Q&A.
Thank you very much. My name is Taehyun Nam, and I'm the last panel speaking in this very delayed presentation, so it's not really a perfect position, but thank you for having me, and I'm pretty sure all of us here in this room know the name Cho Yong-pil, the greatest singer probably in South Korea. The reason why I say this is because Bruce Cumings is like a Cho Yong-pil to students of Korean politics. So it's really hard to explain to people who do not Cho Yong-pil how great he is, right? But he's great. So I'm kind of trying to convey the sense of how great he is, Bruce Cumings is, because he's Cho Yong-pil. And I like to sort of echo, I know I'm the last person, so everybody's sort of ready to go out and finish this. I'm done with this. I will be really brief, I promise. I'd like to just echo Dr. Cumings' point on the U.S. obsession with the nuclear power and nuclear issues, which sort of suck up all these airs of conversation, hence leave not a lot of room for other things, right? And it kind of, in that sense, blinds us to see anything else that is possible. So that's the United States, that's South Korean government, that's China, that's pretty much everybody, but that's not the only thing that blinds us, I think. How about the obsession with the big words like reunification, war and peace? I mean, they are important and they are critical, and we spend a lot of money, I mean, including this very panel. So I'm not saying they are not important, but I like to sort of talk about something small, right? Something in between peace and war. Something that I think we can do, but somehow we just cannot do it because we don't see it. We don't even dare to dream. of doing it, right? So what are those small things? I mean, imagine, right, if you can buy a train ticket and in the Busan station and then go through all the way, Korean Peninsula and Siberia, and then let's just say landed in Paris. If we can do that, I don't think people will sort of obsessed with these big words, right? Because they don't really matter. Peace or unification or Kim that, Kim all this, Kim that, right? So I think we really try to do something, right? Something that we can do. And is it easy? No. We tried, and North Korea sort of responded, but they put on break, right? If we think about the train issue. So it is not easy because, of course, everything we do is related to this power politics of international big players, right? United States, Russia, China, right? So our power, even though we feel great about ourselves, right? When it comes to security issues, our power is really limited. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that we cannot do anything about this situation. So there are some things that we can do, and only we can do, right? Why don't we just try to do something that South Korean government can do and must do, I think, right? I don't know if you watched Netflix or, I don't know, Viki or TV dramas, one of which is, I forgot the title of the show, but the South Korean Son Ye-jin go to North Korea. See, everybody knows, right?
Crash Landing on You.
Crash Landing on You, and Korean title is? Yeah, there you go. That show is the most popular TV drama in North Korea, right? And it is, of course, South Korea is popular. So that is really having a great impact. And we see everybody smiling, thinking of Son Ye-jin here, or goes, what is his name, the guy. So I think what we can do is, open our border, the South Korean border, to North Korean cultural product. We can allow their airwaves come through South Korea, open the YouTube channels, right? I don't know, let people subscribe to North Korean newspapers, right? Or watch their cartoon, if the animation, what have you, right? So that's something that we can do. Also, we can send North Korean prisoners home and die in peace with their family members, right? That doesn't necessarily, we don't need a U.S. sanction or UN sanction for that, right? We can also end this repressive regime of security laws where we can go to even jail for saying anything positive about North Korean regime and North Korean leaders. When I say this, talk about these security laws in my class with students largely from, here in the United States, they just don't believe it, right? They don't believe South Korea still have these security laws. Well, we can end it. We should end it, and only we can end it, right? So that I think we can change our mindset, right? We still see North Korea as an enemy. A lot of us see North Korea as an enemy. Come on, we fought a war with the Chinese, and we are so fine with the Chinese money, Chinese tourists, I don't know, Chinese phone or Chinese food too, right? So what's wrong with having a sort of new thought about these North Koreans? Why should we still hate North Koreans? Yeah, we fought a war. We fought a war with the Vietnamese too, right? So I think what we really need is those small things that change us first, because, well, that's the only thing we can do about it, actually, right? But since we are so flooded and quagmired by all these big things, like, I don't know, this sanction, that sanction, nuclear weapon, this missile, right? We don't really think about things that we can do, right? But I think those are truly important paths that we really have to open and embrace ourselves. And I really urge, well, actually I'm disappointed, right, by Moon Jae-in government for that lack of action. 민주당, for example, they have all these seats and majority in the Congress and seats in the Blue House still, right? They never budged, right, on these things that we can do. So we got to do something. We start somewhere, right? We should stop pretending that we are doing something that, right, when in fact we cannot really do something about U.S. troops in the South Korea, all these nuclear programs, right? They are out of our reach. So I'd like to sort of urge people and brothers and sisters, everybody in South Korea and here who share the dream of a peace in Korean Peninsula, I urge them to sort of take action. Small as, you know, looking at North Koreans differently. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nam, Professor Nam. One thing, solid action that you can take is my colleague Colleen posted in the Zoom, the Advocacy Week registration, and another link that you can take a look at. So please do participate in the Advocacy Week. For those of you joining here at Weston, I am sure you can get a link at the table. There, I saw some petition going on. So please do sign up for the Advocacy Week, which is a real way to tell our Congress to actually move end the Korean War with the peace treaty. This year we're pushing for co-sponsor of our House of Representatives to co-sponsor HR 3446, Brad Sherman, Korean Peninsula Peace on Korean Peninsula Act. So thank you, Dr. Nam, Professor Nam, for bringing that action step. I do have a question from a person that's joining from Zoom, and then I'll open up the floor for the press joining here on the in person. So Hyun-jin Lim from New York, he says, he or she, they say, Professor Cumings, listening to you speaking about B-2 bombers during Obama administration and wishful thinking of North Korea collapse after the fall of Berlin Wall, I just want to start out by saying you are the first non-Korean Korea expert that actually understands nature of North Korea and complexity of divided Korea. It is very concerning that the level of understanding of so-called Korea experts are so low to the point that I often wonder about the validity of education/information that they have received during their school years and tenure. This is truly troublesome to think how much mess and turmoil these experts are causing for the peace and unification of Korea. Why do you think this is the case, and is there a way to fix this?
Well, thank you very much for that interesting question. And before I try to answer it, I'd like to thank my colleagues here for the very generous things they said about my work and my books. I really appreciate it. I never imagined in 1981 that my first book might have relevance in 2021. I wasn't even sure I'd be around in 2021. It's a long time, but it sort of parallels the what's the word I'm looking for? The paralysis of the Korean problem. We're still talking about the same things that we did 20 or 30 years ago, and I just have a deep desire as a foreigner that the Korean situation should somehow be resolved peacefully in a united Korea. In answer to the question, I often come to Washington for conferences, sometimes ones that the government or State Department sponsors, and sometimes think tanks like Carnegie. And it's a really different atmosphere here. You have a consensus among Korea experts inside the Beltway, whether they identify with a Democratic or Republican administration, a consensus about North Korea, that it's one of the worst places in the world, that it's very dangerous, that it has to give up its nuclear weapons, that it's an issue of non-proliferation rather than an issue of our 75-year involvement, often a determining involvement in the Korean Peninsula. It's hard to express it without being there yourself, but I'll give you just one example. When George W. Bush was president, he was getting ready to invade Iraq in the fall of 2002, and he sent a State Department envoy to North Korea to accuse them of having a second nuclear program in enriched uranium. And this then resulted in North Korea leaving the Non-Proliferation Treaty for the second time, getting back all of its plutonium, so on and so forth. Shortly after that, I went to a conference, I think it was at Georgetown. I was very skeptical about this new intelligence on North Korea. How could they suddenly have developed an enriched uranium program when it takes so long for a program like that to actually produce highly enriched uranium? And I was sitting there, and Bob Gallucci and a number of other people who had been in the Clinton administration were all agreeing that this intelligence was really important. And there was a kind of unanimity about George W. Bush, who I don't think should be trusted with a nuclear weapon, let alone trusted with our North Korea policy. This was the moment when the Clinton administration's freeze that they worked out with North Korea in 1994 was broken and ultimately resulted in North Korea testing nuclear weapons. It was an absolute critical time, and yet here's a bunch of Beltway experts, and they're all going along with intelligence that they probably couldn't even see if they wanted to. But there are other experiences I've had here that are like that, not here at Seven Corners, but in Washington, where you get a kind of groupthink that's really hard to penetrate. I mean, I had an experience where I came here and some kid, about 18, 19 years old, picked me up at the airport to go to a conference. And he said, well, you're really a bomb thrower, aren't you? And I looked at him, and I came close to saying, you little pimp, talking to a senior professor like that, but I never call people on things like that, but I just thought to myself, this kid, thinks he knows who I am because of what he hears in Washington. And I could go on with other examples, but there's just a real problem of groupthink, like-mindedness among Korea experts here who, like I said, either identify with the Democrats or the Republicans. These are the only Democrats and Republicans who can get along with each other. They're all here hoping that they'll get a new post in foreign policy in the next administration or the current one. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cumings. So Dr. Cumings is definitely our highlight, but if you have any questions for any of the panels, this is the time. We have 5 more minutes, and then we'll wrap up with Minister and Consul General with his remarks. Any questions 혹시 질문 있으신 분들은 커밍스 교수님뿐만 아니고 크리스티님, 혁교님에게 질문하셔도 됩니다. 네, 이창열 기자님.
Maybe I think I have to use English. Hello, my name is Cheng Won Lee. I am a reporter from the Korea Times. Now, the Korean War actually broke out 71 years ago. So recently I met many Korean War veterans. And then yesterday actually I met many Korean War veterans and they talked about today's keynote speaker, Bruce Cumings. And then I think there's some distortion. What they said was that this organization invited some leftist scholar. And then I asked why. They said Bruce Cumings just asserting that Korean War, actually lost. South Korea attacked North Korea. That's what the Bruce Cumings asserted. And then before this conference started, I actually had talked with Bruce Cumings, and then is this true? And he said no. Actually North Korea attacked South Korea. I think this had to be, printed or published Korean newspaper a lot. Otherwise, still many Korean people think Bruce Cumings is a leftist scholar, and then he's saying he's just supporting North Korea. But why I'm saying this is that still many Korean people has distorted the fact. Actually, Bruce Cumings is scholar, I'm reporter, we always look at the objective things. And second thing is, rather than this is a question, this is what I feel, the end of Korea will have to be ended. But how? This is very important question. As Bruce Cumings said, if the Korean War ends, normalization happens. The United States and North Korea will exchange the maybe small embassies or kind of counterpoints, and then normalization gonna take place, and then I'm pretty sure that gonna bring the security here on the Korean Peninsula. And then I wanna hear from the Bruce Cumings how we can implement that, because still United States is saying that first the North Korea have to throw the nuclear weapons. And North Koreans say, no, first we cannot believe in you because this is the last leverage. And if we maybe give up the nuclear weapon, maybe you're gonna dump it up, or we do not have any kind of leverage. So what's your opinion? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. I appreciated what my friend here, Mr. Saw, said about the start of the war. When people say, Cumings says the South started the war, that becomes a question like, are you still beating your wife? It has so many assumptions behind it. The fact is that the North Korean invasion was an integral part of several years of history before it. And I have proved, based on General Roberts' own statements in the summer of 1949, that for 6 months the South started more than the majority of the fighting along the 38th parallel. From May to December 1949. It's a fact, it's irrefutable. But the North did not want to fight at that time because they had tens of thousands of soldiers in China fighting in this Chinese Civil War. Also, something very clear in the documentation that's been declassified, but people never talk about that. 60 or 70,000 North Koreans fought in the Chinese Civil War with the communists. They came back here very good troops. What are you going to use them for? Invade the South. So the timing of the North Korean invasion is directly related to what happened in the previous year. It's very clear. I mean, I go to sleep at night without any bad dreams because I know exactly how the Korean War came about. And the responsibility for it is shared. South Korea, North Korea, Russia, China, but the U.S. The U.S. has a huge role in the coming of the war. I mean, I don't want to go on. I know we have to quit and everything, but the U.S. supported some of the worst traitors against the Korean people who fought with the Japanese and military officers. I mean, do you know, this is just one fact that I sometimes tell my students. In the second class of the American Military Academy that came out in October 1946, just a little over a year after the World War II ended, two members of that class were Park Chung-hee and Kim Jae-gyu, both military officers who had served in the Japanese Army. And then, you know, you get the history in 1979 of Kim Jae-gyu blowing Park Chung-hee's brains out. These things are intimately related, and the U.S. is the one that put these people in power and stayed behind them. I mean, as an American, I feel deeply guilty about our role in Korea. I do think, eventually, after 40 years of dictatorship, the Korean people in the South really distinguished themselves with probably the best democratic transition that the world has seen. I really believe that. It is a stable democracy in a world where a lot of the transitions to democracy have failed. But that came with 40 years of American support for dictatorship and very little support for democratic leaders, democratization leaders like Kim Dejung. So it's just, I might be called biased, but as an American, I really think our record in Korea is pitiful. And it's almost as bad now as it ever has been because we have an adversary fully armed with nuclear weapons, and another war could break out. I'm sorry, and now by railing on, I forgot the second part of your question. Oh, how are we going to end all of this? Well, if you have a peace agreement, and as I said earlier, it leads to the normalization of relations between Washington and Pyongyang, that's a major step forward, and it would probably be followed by a prolonged period of division of the two Koreas, but exchanges, people-to-people gatherings of all kinds can go on, and over a period of 20 years perhaps, you might actually be talking about unification. But it seems to me that a peace agreement and normalization where the U.S. would finally have some influence over North Korea would be a major achievement, very beneficial for peace on the Korean Peninsula. And the last thing I would say about this is that, to my mind, the best answer to your question, second part of your question, is Kim Dae-jung's policies toward the North. It was unfortunate that they were called the Sunshine Policy because it sounds Pollyanna-ish, idealist. But I went to his inauguration in February 1998, and I was just flabbergasted by the way he transformed South Korean policy toward the North. And one of the key parts of it was a prolonged period of self-government, provincial self-government for the North Koreans, some kind of confederated system where you have a unified Korea as far as the flag and foreign policy and things like that, but you have a fairly long period of self-government by the North Korean regime as it changes over time. And that, of course, suggests a long, drawn-out period once again, but it is the way to go. he talked about the dignity of the North Koreans. I don't think any South Korean president or major leader ever talked about the dignity of the North Koreans, not meaning the North Korean people, but the dignity of this, of the people of this regime. And so I still think that's a kind of basic set of ideas that will really help down the road. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Can I briefly do the comment about the press responsibility? So on tomorrow's article, please rectify the wrong things that was being said about Bruce Cumings' thesis, that it was not about invasion to North, right? He never said that. But the people who oppose this kind of reasoning use that over and over again, circulate over and over again. Even the local newspaper here, they use it again against this kind of thinking, dialogue, engagement, this kind of thinking, right? So they even attacked 평통 because 평통 invited us and talked about this kind of reasoning. So I hope the press here are responsible, do some fact-checking, and if you can, read this book, as I said. And I think the Korean version is coming out soon, so if you want to read the Korean will be there. Because this is our history. This is our Korean history. But it was hidden. It was hidden for many years because it was classified information. But now we know it's declassified, and we know why it happened in 1945. So hopefully this will be more revealed. More scholars will delve into it. More people are now starting in archives, so more will be revealed. For declassified information are coming out every year. So every details about U.S. role in Korea are coming out. So let us have a new thinking, clear mind. Don't think about prejudices or misinformation. So let's stick to the truth. Thank you.
I wanted to say one more thing, and I really appreciate what was just said. I was accused by the Chun-Doo-hwan regime, or people in the Chun-Doo-hwan regime, of saying the South started the war. In 1984, they banned that book, which made me very proud. It's like being on Richard Nixon's enemies list. But they said I believed the South invaded the North. I never wrote about that in 1984. I wrote about it in my second book, 1991, where I did a long chapter trying to deconstruct the idea that the only thing you need to know about this war is who started it. That was a complete failure, that chapter. But the point that I am making is that these charges are completely political. They have nothing to do with what really happened. If you read the good books that exist on how the war came about, you will see what I said before is exactly right, that there was mutual responsibility. And in June 1950, the only question was which side was going to strike first. In some ways, the North Koreans were stupid in striking first because they played into the hands of American policy. But anyway, I tell this to my students. I don't need to tell the adults in the room, really, but when people start labeling you leftist and saying, you make outrageous comments or you're a bomb thrower, that's just trying to ward people off from reading your work or listening to you, to put you in a cubbyhole so that nobody pays any attention to you. And unfortunately, in this American society, it works pretty well. There are lots of people who are really worth reading and listening to who get marginalized here. But I have to say, thanks to so many Korean friends, I've never felt marginalized. For every Korean who says Cumings is a bomb thrower, there's another one who is reading one of my books, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everybody, especially Christine An for staying for so long. I have to wrap this up because we have to move on with dinner and we have to empty the space. We have time limit, so I have to wrap this up. Please do stay, and I hope that you have opportunity to speak with Dr. Cumings and Mr. Hyuk-kyo and Professor Nam. With the last part of the program, the part that we weren't able to do in the beginning, Minister and Consul General Kwon Se-jung 총영석님, please give your congratulatory remarks or the final remarks for the event. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you, all the panelists, especially Professor Bruce Cumings, and also the President Jae-soo Lee and members of National Unification Advisory Board. I think it's very meaningful to host this Korea Peace Forum and in the Korean War and entering the era of peace. As you know, we are some blocks, we have some feelings that it's not easy to implement that our agenda for peace, because we face so many wars, the physical wars for geopolitics, power politics of Korean Peninsula, and also the leaders of North Korea and other countries, how do they initiate the agenda? That is also important element. But I think a most important element is that the who, other than political realm, that ordinary people and the NGOs and other people's engagement is very important. And then how we can change the course, the mindset, the morale, the general atmosphere, the zeitgeister, that is the mindset of all around our country. And in that sense, I think today's forum will be another turning point to change the course of our mindset, and also how to keep forward the peace movement in Korea. And recently I read a book on the China right after the Korea, the Chinese independent Chinese new China. In 1949. And in between the 1949 to early 1950 is very important, because the Kim Il-sung, visited China, and they urged the Chinese government to send back the three military divisions. But the China decided to send back 2 military divisions composed of 40,000 military men to North Korea. That is a very important fact, because if China did not send back the troops, and that in the case, I think the Kim Il-sung could not decide to initiate the war. So China is very important. Still, starting the Korean War, Chinese factor is very important, and ending the war, also Chinese factor is important. So I think that the diplomacy is very important right now. But for diplomacy, you can support the Korean government, the other U.S. government. All together, we should strengthen our power. But first, my question is how to change North Korea. How North Korea can react to our movement. That is our core question right now. But we should, but step by step, we should give more. More opportunity to have more dialogue and diplomacy and dialogue, and then we can start small step, and the small step can be a big step. So that's why it came here. But I think it's not and but a small step is very important. So I think we should keep moving, and we are strengthening our power and to make a big change together. Thank you very much.
This would wrap the Forum. Please do stay and enjoy dinner, and we hope that you have some opportunity to speak with Dr. Cumings and the other panelists. Thank you very much for joining us today.